Kentucky knew how to keep a secret. It buried them beneath coal dust and corn roots, beneath wedding rings women never chose to wear and graves marked only by wind-leaning crosses. In the late summer of 1888, when the air tasted like iron and storms crawled slow across the sky, a woman was led away from her own front porch like livestock being counted and priced. Neighbors watched without speaking. They watched her husband take the reins of a tall, restless horse and hand over something far more breakable. He called it fairness. He called it fate. He called it what a man had to do when a wife could give him no heir. She did not scream. The scream lived somewhere deeper, beneath her ribs, beneath the quiet way she stepped down from that porch and followed the widowed brother who now owned her like a piece of winter land. He never touched her arm. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to close the world in around her, like a barn door drawn against a storm. The road stretched empty, winding through woods that leaned close and listened, as if the trees themselves were learning a new cruelty. By the time his house came into view, it already felt as if something had claimed her long before he had. It stood alone on a ridge, roof sloping like a tired shoulder, windows reflecting nothing but shadow. No birds perched on its rafters. No dogs barked. The wind paused at its threshold the way a sensible thing pauses before stepping into danger. He told her she would sleep in the room his wife once slept in. He said it the way someone speaks of a grave. And as twilight crawled down the hills and settled its weight upon the land, the house seemed to breathe, slow, patient, hungry. In the small Kentucky town, the first cruelty was never loud. It was woven quietly into the air people breathed, whispered into kitchens, church pews, and fields until it became something heavier than truth. The woman had once been spoken of as a bride, then as a wife, and finally as a disappointment, her worth reduced to the children she could not bear. Every month that passed without a cradle being built seemed to strip another layer of humanity from her, until neighbors stopped addressing her by name and began referring to her like she was a failed crop or a cracked well. Women offered sympathetic smiles that were not truly kind, because pity was only another shape of judgment. Men nodded at her husband in that silent way men do when they think they understand another man's burden. Even the church, where she once sought comfort, echoed with sermons about duty, lineage, and divine purpose that felt aimed at her skin, her bones, her womb. The word barren didn't just describe her, it followed her, clung to her clothes, stuck to her footsteps, and she could feel it every time she stepped out into the sunlight. It was as if the town had decided that emptiness lived inside her and therefore she could never again be whole. The isolation grew not just from what people said, but from how they stopped saying anything at all, how their silence became a wall taller than any distance. Children stared at her like she was someone who carried a curse in her shadow. Older women spoke in lowered voices about how a house without children never felt like a home, and she could feel their words brushing against her back as she walked away. Her husband, once tender, once patient, began to look at her with something like accusation, as if she were deliberately denying him his legacy. Nights in their house grew quieter, colder, more brittle, and every gesture of his became a reminder that she had failed at the one thing the world decided mattered. The town didn't need to punish her openly, its collective belief in her inadequacy did the work, turning her into an object of quiet shame, an omen of misfortune, until even she began to wonder whether she truly carried something barren not only in her body but in her very existence, and the weight of that belief pressed down on her life like a slow, relentless hand that would not lift even when she tried to breathe. The decision did not come like a thunderclap, it crept in quietly, shaped by pride, desperation, and the cruel arithmetic of a world that measured a woman's value by what she could produce. Her husband had begun visiting his widowed brother more often, their conversations lingering into dusk, their voices low and heavy with the kind of talk that never intended kindness. The horse stood there in the brother's pasture, a powerful creature with dark eyes and restless muscle, a symbol of worth and strength and future, everything he felt slipping through his fingers because his home remained silent of children. Eventually, talk turned into bargain, and bargain turned into something far worse than cruelty, it became transaction. Her husband convinced himself that he was making a practical choice, that a life could be exchanged as easily as land or livestock if it meant reclaiming the dignity he believed had been taken from him. The widowed brother, hollowed by grief and loneliness, saw an opportunity not only to replace what death had taken from him but to gain it without the burden of courting or pleading with fate again. When the day came, The sun did not dim and no omen appeared in the sky. It was an ordinary afternoon when something unforgivable was done as casually as a trade between neighbors. She was told not with tenderness, not with apology, but with a tone that suggested inevitability, as if this was the natural sequence of things and she should not struggle against it. Her husband negotiated her existence like she was a tool too costly to waste, and the horse, breathing hard and stamping the dirt, became the measure of her worth. No papers were signed, no judge present, only nods, a handshake, and the cold acceptance of two men who believed they had the right to decide where her life belonged. The town, already complicit in her humiliation, did not intervene. Some shook their heads, some whispered, but no one stepped forward, and that silence wrapped around her like binding rope. She stood there as ownership shifted around her, realizing in that terrible moment that she had not simply lost a marriage, she had been reassigned like a possession, traded away not for love or mercy but for the gleam of an animal and the bruised pride of men who believed her body and fate were theirs to barter, and in that realization something inside her went very still, as if the part of her that still believed she mattered was being led away with the horse while she remained behind, newly claimed, newly diminished, and already disappearing into a life she never chose. The journey to the widowed brother's land felt like being carried deeper into a place the world itself preferred to forget, the road narrowing into a thin ribbon of dirt bordered by trees that loomed too close, their branches knitting overhead until daylight seemed to dim even before the sun began to lower. The silence along the way pressed against her ears, not peaceful but watchful, and every rustle in the brush sounded like something keeping pace with them, curious about the new thing being delivered into its territory. The air grew heavier the further they traveled, thick with the scent of damp soil and something older, something that did not feel entirely natural. She sensed wrongness before she saw anything tangible, an unease coiling inside her as if her body understood truths her mind hadn't yet allowed itself to name. When the homestead finally appeared through the trees, it did not look like a home so much as a wound carved into the landscape, a lonely structure perched on tired land that seemed to sag beneath its weight. The house did not welcome, it watched, its windows dark and reflective, catching her shape and throwing it back at her as something unfamiliar. The yard was too quiet, no dogs barking, no chickens scratching, nothing moving except the wind that slowed as it reached the house, as though even it hesitated to cross whatever unseen threshold lay there. Fences leaned inward like ribs around a frail body, and the earth bore the look of land often disturbed, as if someone was always digging, always burying something they hoped would not return. The widowed brother spoke little, his voice flat, his eyes never lingering long on her face, and yet she felt weighed, measured, claimed without ceremony. The interior smell that drifted through the open door was a stale mix of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like the ghost of dried blood. Even before she stepped inside, a chill crept along her spine, not from cold but from the sense that the house did not simply stand there. It listened, it remembered, and it had been waiting for her in a way that made the world beyond its walls feel impossibly far away, as if once she crossed inside there would be no easy way back, no voice to hear her if she called, only the echo of whatever lived in the quiet places of that land, watching and waiting for her to take her first breath as though she were already stepping into a story that did not intend to release her. From the first night beneath that roof it became clear she had not been brought there to be seen but to be filled into the outline of someone else, as if the widowed brother believed grief could be stitched shut by forcing another woman to wear the shape of the one he had lost. He rarely spoke her name. In truth, it seemed to trouble him, like a reminder that she was a different person than the ghost he still served. Instead, he addressed her with the same soft, deliberate tone he might once have used for his dead wife, the cadence practiced and unsettling, his eyes clouding not with affection but with expectation, as though he were waiting for her to respond not as herself but as someone who no longer existed. He placed her in the same bed where another woman had slept and perhaps died, told her which dresses to wear from a chest that did not belong to her, guided her hands to tasks already haunted with memory, each one meant to anchor her more firmly into a role she had never agreed to hold. The walls were not decorated with life but with relics, preserved like altars, hair combs, ribbons, faded photographs where smiles looked trapped rather than joyful. He never struck her, never shouted, but his calm was a cage, his grief a command she could not disobey. When she tried to speak of herself, of the life she came from, the words fell uselessly between them because he did not want a woman with a past, he wanted a vessel to continue a life interrupted. Even his touches felt rehearsed, not intimate but ritualistic, as if he were performing something sacred to him and deeply wrong to her, attempting to summon warmth from a body that trembled beneath the weight of borrowed identity. At meals he would pause, as though listening for another voice to answer him, and when only silence replied, his gaze would harden just a little more, not with cruelty, but with determination to make her vanish into the remembrance he cherished so fiercely. There was no room in that house for who she truly was. Every corner insisted on comparison, every object whispered of someone she could never be, until she began to feel herself thinning at the edges, fading beneath the relentless pressure of a love that was never meant for her, only for the echo he refused to let go, while the house seemed to press closer in quiet agreement, urging her to surrender the last fragile pieces of her own name. She began to notice the house did not merely contain memories, it curated them, arranging remnants of the dead wife like offerings, each object placed with too much intention to be casual. There was a room he rarely entered, and when he did, he closed the door quickly, as if air itself should not be allowed to escape. Curiosity was not something she had the safety to indulge, yet fear became its own form of courage, and one afternoon when the wind howled against the shutters and he had gone to tend the fields, she turned the handle and stepped inside. The room smelled of something trapped between sweetness and rot, a lingering perfume that clung stubbornly to the faded fabrics draped over chairs and the bed neatly made as though its occupant might return at any moment. Dresses hung like husks of a life that had once moved and breathed inside them, some stained with seams of brown that looked suspiciously like old blood, others marked by small tears stitched closed not with care but with desperation. On a desk, she found notebooks filled with cramped, fevered writing, pages crowded with prayers, symbols, and frantic pleas that blurred faith with obsession, passages begging something unseen to listen, to return, to answer. Between pressed flowers and brittle locks of hair tucked inside folded cloth, she discovered small charms constructed of bone, thread, and needlework, items that felt less like keepsakes and more like tools for calling something back that had already decided to leave. Each page she turned deepened the sense that grief here had not been mournful but hungry, transforming love into ritual, loss into fixation. The floorboards creaked softly, not under her weight alone, but with a subtle vibration as though the house recognized what she touched and disapproved. Mirrors were covered with thin cloth, and when she lifted one edge for only a second, her reflection appeared distant and altered, a stranger wearing her features, eyes wide not only with fear but with the realization that she had stepped into a story still unfolding, one the dead wife had not finished writing. Every object she handled seemed to whisper secrecy, warning, and devotion twisted into something dark, and when she finally backed away, heart pounding, she understood that she was not meant to see these things, not meant to understand how deeply the house and its owner still served a memory that refused to loosen its grip, that she had walked into the center of a longing so fierce it no longer cared what it destroyed in order to feel whole again, and the room seemed to breathe around her, as if something inside it had just opened its eyes and noticed she was there, waiting, watching, almost hopeful in the way a wound waits for a new blade. Rumors in the nearby town did not travel like ordinary gossip, they crept with caution, as if even repeating them might stir something that preferred to remain undisturbed. When she began venturing into town for supplies, people who once refused to look directly at her now stared a little too long, their eyes haunted with reluctant knowledge. One old woman, hands trembling as she passed over a bundle of cloth, murmured that grief had hollowed the widowed brother out and left space for things that did not belong inside a man. Another warned her in a whisper that no one visited his land after sundown, not because of wolves or thieves, but because the air itself changed there, growing dense with a presence that felt neither alive nor merciful. They spoke cautiously of hearing cries in the wind years after the funeral, of lights flickering in the windows long past midnight, of movements seen at the edge of fields where no living body stood. She tried to dismiss their words as superstition, remnants of a world that explained pain with spirits and curses, yet the house itself refused to let her believe in rational comfort. At night, footsteps paced places where the widowed brother slept soundly, their rhythm too slow to be human, too patient to belong to an animal. Doors that she locked quietly unlatched themselves. Mirrors fogged with a breath that was not hers, and when she wiped them, for the briefest heartbeat it seemed as if another face lingered behind her own, watching with an expression not of rage, but of possessive sorrow. The widowed brother grew strangely calm as these things intensified, as though he recognized each disturbance like an old friend returning, assuring her it was only the house settling, only wind, only imagination, but there was no warmth in his reassurances, only something like anticipation. Outside, the land seemed to press inward, trees leaning closer, shadows deepening earlier each evening, the sky above their property dimming faster than the world beyond it. Even the silence carried shape, thick with listening. She began to understand the warnings were not superstition at all but unfinished sentences the townspeople dared not complete, hints at a truth they were too frightened to claim aloud, that whatever haunted the house was not simply grief echoing through empty rooms but something invited, welcomed, nurtured, something that had learned to stay because it had been given a reason not to leave. Shadows in that house did not behave like shadows should. They lingered even when the lamps were lit, stretching too far, bending around corners as though reluctant to disappear, and sometimes she swore they hesitated when she moved, as if deciding whether to follow. At night, the hallways breathed with quiet movement, boards creaking under a weight that did not match the widowed brother's steps, their cadence soft and deliberate, as though something walked not beside her but within the walls themselves. When she stood alone, the air thickened around her, pressing against her skin the way a hand might rest on a shoulder without warmth. Mirrors fogged in the stillness, slow circles appearing as if someone stood just behind her, exhaling patiently, whispering with a voice she could not hear but could feel in her bones. The house never settled into silence. It hummed with a low, unsettled sound like a heart still beating in a body long past saving. Sometimes, when she crossed a doorway, the room seemed surprised by her, objects subtly shifted, curtains swaying when there was no draft, chairs angled differently than before, as though something had stepped away a moment too late. The whispering began faintly, never in clear words, only the delicate brushes of syllables sliding along the edge of her awareness, calling to her, not cruelly but with a terrible tenderness, a voice that carried yearning rather than rage, as if whatever lingered wanted not to harm her but to hold her, to shape her, to claim her as part of its unfinished story. At night she would wake with the unmistakable sensation of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping gently, the sheets rustling without hands, the presence patient, waiting, as though it was remembering how to be close to a human body. Even the daylight failed to chase it away, morning sun slid across the floor like something unwelcome, and for a fleeting second she would glimpse movement in the glass of the window, not a reflection but a figure shifting, watching, existing where light could not reach. She could not tell whether the presence mourned or possessed, whether it wept for what had been lost or reached greedily for what remained, only that every day it grew bolder, more certain, its unseen gaze learning her shape, her breath, her trembling, until the house no longer felt haunted by echoes but inhabited by a consciousness that was slowly drawing closer, as if each whisper, each footstep, each shadow leaning forward was part of a slow approach that would end when it no longer had to hide at all. The truth did not come as confession. It seeped out in fragments, in the way his voice shifted when the house stirred, in the reverence with which he spoke of the woman who had died as if she were not gone but merely misplaced, waiting to be retrieved. One evening when the lamps burned low and the night outside pressed thick against the windows, he finally spoke plainly, not trembling, not ashamed, almost proud in a quiet, fevered way. He did not want simply a companion, he said, nor a replacement, nor a wife whose presence could soothe his loneliness. What he wanted was continuation, restoration, the resurrection of a life stolen from him, and he believed, truly believed, that grief did not have to be permanent if a body could be willing enough to invite something back. He had prayed beyond prayer, pleaded beyond sanity, and when heaven refused to answer, he turned to the old writings, the strange symbols, the desperate rituals left behind by his wife in those secret rooms. He told her that some bonds did not break with death, that love was stronger than earth or coffin or God's silence, and what lingered in the house was not torment but devotion searching for a vessel. His eyes glowed with certainty as he said she was chosen not because she was unwanted but because she was empty in a way he believed the world had made cruel, an emptiness he thought could be filled with purpose rather than shame. He spoke of signs he had felt in the nights, of how the house breathed differently since she arrived, of footsteps that followed her because they recognized a doorway when they saw one. He insisted it was mercy, that the dead wife deserved breath again, movement again, warmth again, and she should feel honored to give it. His tenderness was more terrifying than anger could have been. He touched her gently, as one touches something sacred, not seeing fear in her eyes, only seeing possibility. In that moment she understood that she had not been traded merely to serve a living man's pride but to receive the weight of a love so twisted it sought to resurrect itself through her suffering, to take root inside her until she no longer belonged to herself at all, until even her breath might not be her own, and the house, as if agreeing, seemed to lean closer around them, listening, waiting, breathing with them. It was a slow, dawning realization that unspooled inside her like a thread pulling tighter with every heartbeat, that the humiliation she had endured and the isolation she had been forced into were not mere cruelties of men but the careful construction of something far older and far darker than she had imagined. The house, the widowed brother, the relics of the woman who had died, all of it converged into a single, terrible purpose, and she felt it pressing against her chest like a hand she could not shake. She was not simply a replacement, not merely a pawn to soothe grief. She was intended as a vessel, a body to hold a presence that had refused to leave, that had been invited to remain, nurtured through obsession and ritual until it could cross the threshold of the living. Every whispered warning she had heard from the town, every shadow that had lingered just beyond sight, every footstep she had felt in the hallway that was not his, all of it now made a terrible, relentless sense. The air around her seemed charged with expectation, thick and viscous, carrying the weight of eyes she could not see and voices she could not understand but that knew her intimately, calling her by a name that was not hers. She realized that every act of obedience demanded by the widowed brother, every repetition of gestures meant to honor a memory, every careful placement of objects and attention to rituals, had been designed to prepare her, to ready her for a role she had never chosen, a sacrifice that would strip her of identity and leave her hollow in order to host something neither living nor dead. The house no longer seemed like a shelter or a prison but like an organism, patient and watchful, its walls bending toward her as if sensing her recognition of the truth. She understood that escape would not be simple. She was not just confined by doors or land but by intention, by the meticulous orchestration of desire and grief that had carved a path for her from the moment she left her husband's home. The horror settled in her stomach like cold stone, the knowledge that she was meant to endure, to resist, to serve unwillingly, and that every flicker of light and shadow, every sound in the house, every object preserved in memory, was part of a design that had nothing to do with mercy or kindness. The realization left her trembling, not only with fear but with clarity, and the weight of it pressed her down until she understood fully that her life had been claimed long before she crossed the threshold, that she was now bound to a purpose as inexorable as the tide, and that surviving it would require more than courage, it would require a confrontation with the very darkness that had summoned her there. She began to understand that the real danger in that house was not something that could be chased away by light or shouted down, that it was neither fully spirit nor fully flesh, but the product of human obsession and supernatural insistence intertwined so tightly that separating them seemed impossible. The widowed brother, who had once appeared merely lonely or grief-stricken, revealed in subtle ways the depth of his intent, his calm precision, the careful preservation of every belonging of the dead wife, the measured way he guided her into roles and gestures not her own. All of it was part of a plan that had begun long before she arrived, a plan in which she was no longer a person but a vessel, a participant in a ritual she could scarcely comprehend. Nights stretched endlessly, the shadows elongating and twisting around her, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, calling her with names she had never been given, drawing her attention to corners of the house she had not yet entered, places that seemed to breathe in expectation. She realized that the haunting she had feared from the beginning was only partially what lingered here. The true horror was the human will behind it, the conviction that she could be molded, occupied, and used to complete a story begun by grief and left unfinished. Her mind raced with the understanding that escape was not just about leaving the house physically, but about resisting a force that had already been invited in, that had grown accustomed to her presence, and that could not easily be denied. The house seemed almost alive in response to her thoughts, responding with faint creaks, drafts, and the subtle movement of objects, reminding her that she was not merely witnessing this power, but part of it, entwined in its design. Each day, the boundaries between what was alive, what was dead, and what was neither blurred further, leaving her unsure whether the figure she sensed in the dark corners was grief itself, a spirit returned, or simply the reflection of the brother's obsession made manifest. The realization sharpened into a terrible clarity. The monster was not just the house, nor the shadows, nor even the spectral presence she could feel pressing near. The true threat was the men who had claimed her, whose pride and sorrow had summoned forces beyond their understanding, and the weight of that truth pressed down with relentless inevitability. She understood, with bone-deep certainty, that survival would not be passive, that to endure what had been planned for her, she would have to confront both the restless, lingering presence and the living architect of her suffering, the one who had traded her life as easily as land for a horse, and that in this confrontation lay the narrowest path between life and the darkness that sought to consume it.